The reward came 5 days after the defiance. That is the first thing you need to understand. 5 days. Not a week. Not a month. Not after a formal board review or a court of inquiry had run its course. 5 days after a sergeant named Walter Eugene Briggs, 26 years old from Scranton, Pennsylvania, 2 years and 4 months in uniform, 14 months in the European theater, refused to carry out a direct order from a superior officer, General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding officer of the Third United States Army, closed the disciplinary flag, and issued the promotion in the same administrative action. The documents are in the same folder. They have always been in the same folder. The defiance and the reward, together in the same record, because they were always part of the same story. November 19th, 1944. A forward supply and transit depot outside the town of Metz, France. Third Army had taken Metz 12 days earlier after a siege that had lasted longer than Patton wanted and cost more than anyone had planned. The depot was operating as both a logistics waypoint and a temporary prisoner holding facility. German prisoners captured in the fall of the city and the surrounding fortifications were being held there in transit, waiting for assignment to rear area facilities as the administrative process caught up to the speed of the advance. The officer in charge of the prisoner section was a lieutenant named Harold Voss, 29, from Madison, Wisconsin. He had received an order that morning from his sector administrative superior directing him to process a specific group of 33 prisoners for immediate transfer to a labor assignment compound 27 kilometers to the rear. The order was written, signed, dated. It bore the stamp of the administrative section of 12 Corps. It specified the transfer group, the destination, the route, and the security arrangement. For men, standard escort, standard category, standard procedure. Sergeant Walter Briggs was assigned to lead that escort. What happened in the following 3 hours is documented in 2 places initially. In Briggs's own statement, submitted to the depot's military police detachment on November 20th, 1944, the morning after the event, and in Lieutenant Voss's incident report, filed the same morning and flagged to his administrative superior at 12 Corps with a notation that read, urgently requiring review. A third document came later. A 12 Corps military police investigation report, assembled over the following 4 days, which reached Patton's desk in summary on November 23rd and in full on November 24th. He read it the same afternoon. His aide later wrote that Patton did not speak while he was reading. He read the entire report without speaking, set it down, and asked one question. That question is documented. We'll get to it. Subscribe. This channel exists so that records like this one are not forgotten. Now here's what you need to know about Sergeant Briggs before we go any further. Briggs had been in the European theater since September 1943. He had come ashore in Italy before the transfer to the French theater and had been reassigned to Third Army during the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944. He was not a man with a record of difficulty. His commanding officer, a captain named Frank Dunmore, 34, from Louisville, Kentucky, would later describe him in his report as one of the steadiest non-commissioned officers in the company. Not the loudest, not the most decorated, the steadiest. The kind of man you assign to something when you need it done correctly and without incident. The prisoner section at the Metz depot had been his assignment since late October. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, Briggs had processed escorts for 14 separate prisoner transfers. Not one incident. Not one flag. Not one report from any of the 14 escorts that anything had occurred outside of standard procedure. He was 14 transfers into a clean record when he refused the 15th. Let me back up for a moment, because the reason he refused is the reason this story exists, and it requires some setting up to be understood correctly. The 33 men designated in the transfer order had been captured in 2 separate engagements during the fall of Metz. Their intake processing, conducted between November 8th and November 11th, had classified them using the standard intake documentation review. Their paperwork listed them as Wehrmacht Regular Army, various infantry and support units, consistent with the garrison forces that had held the Metz fortifications. Based on that classification, they had been assigned a standard labor-eligible transfer designation, which was the designation used for prisoners cleared for assignment to the rear area labor compounds that were supporting Third Army's logistics infrastructure. Standard designation. Standard paperwork. Standard transfer. Sergeant Briggs had begun the loading process at 0730 on November 19th. He stopped at 25 minutes later. He stopped it not because the paperwork had changed. The paperwork had not changed. The paperwork still said what it had said when it was filed. He stopped it because he had spent 40 minutes in proximity to 33 men he was preparing to load, and something was wrong. Here is something that does not appear in any manual produced by any military administration in any country at any point in the Second World War. 14 months in the European theater, 14 prisoner escort operations, 6 weeks running a prisoner section at a forward depot. That experience produces a specific kind of knowledge. Not book knowledge, not classroom knowledge. The kind of knowledge that comes from spending 1,000 hours in the company of German military prisoners of every kind and learning, through the specific friction of proximity and repetition, how to read what you are looking at. Briggs had that knowledge. He had learned to read the way a group held itself when it was comfortable with its situation and when it was not. He had learned what Wehrmacht infantry looked like when they understood they were prisoners being transferred to labor assignment, which was not a pleasant situation, but was a survivable one, a situation men with some hope could be read to understand. He had learned the difference between men who had accepted their situation and men who had not. He had learned what men looked like when they were still calculating. 25 minutes into the loading, he pulled his escort aside and told them to hold the prisoners in place. He went to Lieutenant Voss. He said, according to his own statement, "Sir, I am requesting an individual documentation review for the transfer group before we move out." Voss looked at the order. The order was written and signed. The destination compound was waiting. The depot was over capacity. The route needed to be run before dark. Voss said, "The order is signed, Sergeant." "Load them up," Briggs said. "Sir, I am requesting an individual review." Voss said, "That is a direct order." "Load the vehicles." Briggs said, "Sir, I cannot execute the transfer as written without an individual review of the transfer group." Then he walked back to the loading area. He told his escort to stand the prisoners down. He returned 33 men to the holding compound. He sent word to the depot's military police detachment, requesting a documentation officer. And he stood his escort in place at the holding compound perimeter and waited. Voss's incident report noted that he was in the process of preparing a disciplinary flag for insubordination when the military police documentation officer arrived and began the review. The review took 55 minutes. Briggs stood at the perimeter the entire time. He was right about 19 of the 33. 19 of the 33 men in the labor-eligible transfer group were not Wehrmacht regular army. They were determined through individual documentation review, including physical examination and cross-referencing against 12 Corps' SS personnel records, to be Waffen-SS soldiers who had discarded or modified their identifying documentation and insignia prior to or at the time of capture. Some had substituted Wehrmacht unit identifiers obtained from killed or captured German infantry. Some had simply removed identifying insignia and provided false unit designations during intake. The intake processing officer, who had been working an 18-hour shift during the height of the Metz prisoner intake surge, had not had the time or the information to catch it. 19 SS men in a labor-eligible transfer group. 4-man escort. 27 kilometers of road through territory that was still contested in places, still producing ambush reports, still finding German stay-behind units in the farms and with lines between Metz and the rear area compound. 19 SS men in a group that had already demonstrated, by surviving intake processing with false documentation, a specific and organized willingness to manipulate the administrative systems that were supposed to be managing them. Briggs had read all of that standing at the back of a transport vehicle in 25 minutes. Now, here's what the 12 Corps military police investigation found about those 19 men when the documentation review passed their files to the intelligence section. 7 of the 19 were identified as members of SS security and policing units that had operated in the Lorraine and Alsace-Lorraine regions during the German occupation. 2 of the 7 were specifically identified as persons of interest in an active investigation being conducted by Third Army's Judge Advocate General Section in coordination with French civil and military authorities regarding SS unit activities in the Moselle Valley during 1942 and 1943. Specific activities. Documented activities. The kind that produce war crimes investigation files. 2 of the 19 men who had been in the labor-eligible transfer group, who had been in the vehicles Briggs had halted the loading of, were active persons of interest in war crimes cases. Think about what that means for a moment. Not as an abstraction. Think about the specific mechanical question of what happens to persons of interest in active war crimes investigations when they are loaded into a 4-man escort labor transfer as ordinary prisoners and set on a 27-kilometer road. Think about what men who have already changed their documentation once are willing and able to do when the security arrangement they are in was designed for a different kind of prisoner. Briggs had thought about it at 0755 on November 19th, standing at the back of a transport vehicle with 33 men looking at him, and he had come to the correct conclusion before any investigation had confirmed what those men were. Patton received the full investigation report on November 24th. His aide, a lieutenant named George Carver, 28 from Charleston, South Carolina, was present when he read it. Carver's account of that afternoon was recorded in a personal memoir he completed in 1962, a copy of which was donated to the Citadel's archives in 1974. Carver wrote that Patton read the entire report, and it was not a short report, without interruption. He set it on the desk. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where is the disciplinary flag on the sergeant?" Carver located it in the morning's administrative traffic. He confirmed that it was pending action for insubordination of a direct order. Voss had filed it correctly and completely. Patton said, "What's his record before this?" Carver pulled the file. Clean. 14 escorts. No incidents. Exemplary notation from Captain Dunmore. Patton said, "Get Dunmore." Dunmore came to the command post that afternoon. His meeting with Patton lasted approximately 25 minutes. Carver was not in the room. What Carver records is the moment Dunmore emerged. He writes that Dunmore looked like a man who had expected to be told one thing and had been told something entirely different. He stood outside the command post door for a moment before he walked. That is what Carver says. He stood there for a moment. Patton's instructions to Carver were brief. He gave them before Dunmore had fully cleared the building. He said, "Close the flag on Briggs and promote him." 6 words. 3 for the flag. 3 for the promotion. 6 words that said everything that needed to be said about what Patton had decided when he put the investigation report down on his desk. Now, I want to be precise about what those 6 words meant, because it would be easy to hear them as simply the right outcome in an obvious situation. A sergeant was right. A sergeant got rewarded. The system worked. That reading is available, and it is not wrong, but it is not complete. Patton had spent his entire adult life in a profession that runs on command authority. The principle is not complicated. An order is given. An order is followed. The system works because the order is followed. Not because the order is always right. Because it is followed. An army that follows orders only when the sergeant has decided the orders are correct is not an army. It is a negotiation. And negotiations do not take hills. Patton knew this. He had built a command on it. He had court-martialed men for less than what Briggs had done. He had spoken publicly and on record about what happens to military discipline when non-commissioned officers begin to apply their own judgment to whether an order deserves to be executed. And he had read a file that showed a sergeant applying exactly that judgment to exactly that order, and being right. And he had said, "Close the flag. Promote him." What that required from Patton is not what it required from Briggs. Briggs had required courage. Briggs had stood at the back of a transport vehicle and made a decision that was going to follow him through an administrative process he could not control, in a command that ran on discipline, in a theater where insubordination had consequences. That took something. What Patton required was different. What Patton required was the specific discipline of a general officer who could look at a case where the order was wrong and the sergeant was right and say so out loud in the administrative record, not in a private conversation. In the record, the flag closed, the promotion issued, the folder holding both documents together where anyone who looked could see that the defiance and the reward were the same story. That is harder than it sounds, because every time a commanding general says the sergeant was right, not the order, he is saying something about all orders. He is saying that there is a category of case in which the man who refuses is doing the right thing. And every man in the command who hears that will carry it with him the next time he is loading a vehicle and something feels wrong. Patton was precise enough to understand that. He was also precise enough to understand what 19 SS men in a 4-man escort labor transfer would have looked like on a contested road 27 kilometers from Metz. He chose precision. The promotion paperwork is in the National Archives in the 3rd Army Administrative Records of the 12 Corps sector. Briggs was promoted from Staff Sergeant to Technical Sergeant, effective November 24, 1944. The reason of record is meritorious performance in the execution of prisoner security duties. The disciplinary flag from Voss's incident report is in the same archival folder, closed with a notation that reads, "Resolved, no further action." 2 documents, same folder, the defiance and the reward together in the same record, because that is exactly what they were. Briggs went home to Scranton in the summer of 1945. He worked for a railroad equipment company for 28 years. He died in 1981. His son, who gave a brief account to a Pennsylvania Veterans History Project in 2003, said that his father did not discuss the war in detail. He said there was one thing, one moment, that his father mentioned occasionally when the subject came up. He talked about the morning he stopped the loading. His son said he always described it the same way. He said he was watching the men while the loading was happening, and something was not right. Not the paperwork. The paperwork said what it said, but the men were wrong. He could read it. 14 months had taught him to read it, and he read it correctly, and he could not walk away from what he had read. His son said his father never used the word brave when he described it. He said it was just what the situation required. You could see it, so you did something about it. That was how his father talked about it. You could see it, so you did something about it. The 2 men whose cases were under active war crimes investigation at the time of their identification in the review, both of them were eventually tried. One was tried in the French civilian court system in 1947. The documentation that connected him to the Moselle Valley activities was assembled in part from records in the 12 Corps JAG file. That file is in the National Archives in the same general collection as the Briggs transfer incident report. Adjacent folders, the same building in Maryland. The morning Briggs stopped the loading and the 1947 French war crimes proceeding in the Moselle Valley of 1942, connected by a thread of paper in the same archive. Patton did not live to see the post-war proceedings. He died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in an automobile accident in Mannheim, Germany. His decision on the Briggs flag and promotion was made 5 days after the defiance, on November 24, 1944. He had read the report. He had asked the right question. He had given the right instruction. 6 words in a room in France, recorded by a lieutenant from Charleston who would write them down in a memoir 18 years later and donate it to an archive in South Carolina. Close the flag. Promote him. The folder is in Maryland. Briggs's name is on the promotion. Technical Sergeant, effective November 24, 1944. The flag is in the same folder, closed, no further action. And somewhere in Scranton for 28 years, a man who worked on railroad equipment occasionally told his son about the morning he stopped the loading. And his son would ask him what he had seen. And he would say the men were wrong. He could read it. And he could not get in that vehicle and drive away from what he had read. Sometimes that is the whole of it. You can read it, or you cannot. He could. Subscribe. These men earn at least that much.